Chapter 1. The Encounter at Dawn. The sun had barely risen over the horizon, casting the plains in a faint golden light. John Carter sat astride his horse, Dusty, the rhythm of hooves echoing across the vast emptiness of the desert. His leather gloves creaked as he gripped the reins, his mind 1,000 miles away from the rustling tumbleweeds and the quiet of morning. The wind carried the dry scent of sagebrush, sharp and earthy, whispering the secrets of the land. As he crested a low hill, something caught his eye, movement in the distance. Squinting into the shimmering light, he saw 2 figures stumbling toward him, one small and frail, the other much larger, with a steady, determined gait. His heart skipped a beat. He spurred Dusty forward, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. When he got closer, he saw her clearly, an Apache woman, tall and proud, her face weathered but striking, with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 stories. She was supporting a small child, no older than 6 or 7, who looked half dead from exhaustion. Their clothes were ragged, their skin dry from the relentless sun. John's chest tightened. He had heard tales of such nomads, desperate souls wandering the desert, driven by hunger and thirst. But seeing them like this, it felt different. "Hey there," John called, his voice rough, as if it hadn't been used in days. He pulled Dusty to a stop, the horse snorting and pawing at the dry ground. "You need help?" The woman, her face set like stone, looked at him with suspicion in her eyes. Her grip tightened on the child's frail body. John noticed the girl's hollow eyes, the tremble in her small hands. His stomach twisted, and before he could stop himself, he dismounted. "I've got food," he said, holding up a sack of jerky and a canteen of water. His voice softened, more coaxing and commanding. "I ain't gonna hurt you." The woman eyed him, her posture tense. Every muscle in her body coiled like a spring. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a sharp movement, she shoved the child toward him. "Feed her," the woman said, her voice low, guttural, like it was a demand rather than a plea. "She's hungry." John nodded, crouching down beside the child. The girl looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes, and for a moment they just stared at each other, as if the world had paused around them. John opened the canteen and gently offered her some water. Her small hands trembled as she reached for it, drinking greedily. The woman watched him from a distance, her arms crossed over her chest. There was a wariness in her gaze, but also something else, a quiet calculation. When the girl had her fill, John stood up, wiping his hands on his dusty trousers. He glanced at the woman, and that's when she spoke again. "You fed my daughter," she said, her words heavy in the air. "Now you belong to me." John's heart skipped a beat. His throat went dry, and for a moment he wondered if he had heard her wrong. The silence between them stretched, filled only by the distant call of coyotes and the low hum of the wind. "You're your what?" he asked, barely able to believe it. She stepped forward, her boots kicking up dust, her eyes never leaving his. "You gave my daughter water. You saved her life. You belong to me now. Apache law." John blinked, trying to make sense of her words. But there was no mistaking the fierce determination in her eyes. "Well, ma'am, I don't take kindly promises like that," he said, his voice low, but there was a spark of something, defiance, perhaps, flickering in his chest. He straightened, his boots scraping against the dry earth. "I don't belong to anyone." The woman smiled, but it was a cold, knowing smile, like she knew a secret he didn't. Her eyes glinted with something deeper, something dangerous. "You do now," she replied, her voice steady and unwavering. "And when the time comes, you'll see it." John swallowed hard, unsure whether to laugh or take her seriously. But in the pit of his stomach, a strange sensation began to stir, an unfamiliar tug, like something was pulling him toward her. He shook it off, but the thought lingered, gnawing at him. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the barren land, John couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something far bigger than he could ever have imagined. Chapter 2, A Promise Unbroken. The dusty wind kicked up as the sun climbed higher, beating down relentlessly on the barren plains. John Carter's boots crunched against the dry ground as he rode back to his ranch, the weight of the promise he had made still pressing on his chest. Aiyana's words echoed in his mind. "You fed my daughter. Now you belong to me." The wind whistled through the gaps in the wooden fence, as if nature itself were mocking him. He had no intention of honoring it. But as the ranch house came into view, John's thoughts lingered on the Apache woman. There was something in her gaze, something ancient and fierce, that unsettled him. It wasn't just the promise. It was a pull he felt, like the wind itself was telling him to turn around and ride back. But he had a life here, his ranch, his land, and no Apache woman was going to change that. Yet, despite his resolve, when he tied Dusty to the hitching post outside the house and stepped onto the creaky porch, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he couldn't avoid. Later that evening, as the sky darkened and the stars began to prickle the sky, John stood at the edge of the porch, watching the horizon. The quiet of the night was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves, the faint howl of coyotes in the distance. He heard the faint sound of horse hooves approaching, slow and deliberate. He turned, heart lurching in his chest. And there she was, Aiyana, atop a sturdy bay mare, her daughter still clutching her side, looking as frail as she had when John first met her. John's breath caught. He had expected trouble, but not this. Aiyana rode up slowly, her dark eyes locked on his, her expression unreadable. "You came," John said, his voice a mix of surprise and something deeper, something he couldn't name. Aiyana dismounted, her boots thudding softly on the porch as she stepped forward. Her daughter slid off the horse and stood beside her, clutching her mother's side, wide eyes peeking up at John. "I didn't have a choice," she replied, her voice firm. "You made a promise. Apache law is sacred, and my people do not forget their word." John looked at her, frustration stirring within him. His mind raced. He had heard stories of Apache customs, of their fierce loyalty, but he never imagined he'd be bound by them. He hadn't signed up for this kind of life. And yet, as he looked at Aiyana and her daughter, something in him stirred, something that defied reason. "You don't understand," he began, his voice gruff. "I can't just pick up and leave. This ranch, it's everything to me. I've worked years for it." Aiyana's gaze softened just slightly, though there was still a hardness to her that made John's heart race. "You are a good man, John Carter. You didn't have to help us, but you did. Now you must see your promise through." John took a step back, a knot tightening in his chest. There was no arguing with her, not when she spoke with such certainty, such conviction. The air between them seemed to crackle, heavy with tension, and something else, something too wild to tame. The silence stretched between them, thick and palpable, before John spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask for this. I don't belong to anyone." Aiyana's lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile, her eyes glinting with an unspoken understanding. "Then you don't yet understand what you promised." She turned to her daughter, her hand resting gently on the child's head, before looking back at John. "But you will?" John felt a sudden chill, despite the warmth of the evening. There was something about her words, something that felt like an inescapable truth. He couldn't deny it. The promise he had made was no ordinary thing. It wasn't just a simple favor, a kind gesture. It was a thread that now bound him to her, to this land, to a world he didn't understand but couldn't seem to escape from. Aiyana stepped closer, her presence like the quiet force of a desert storm. The weight of her gaze, unflinching and steady, held him in place. "I'll stay the night," she said, breaking the silence. "And tomorrow we leave for my people." John swallowed, his throat dry. He wanted to protest, wanted to say anything to push her away, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he nodded, as if his body had already agreed to the fate she had set for him. As the night wore on, John couldn't sleep. The promise, the woman, her daughter, they haunted him in a way he didn't understand. The ranch, his home, felt smaller somehow, as if the walls had closed in, and no matter how far he went, he would never escape the pull of the Apache woman's words. At dawn, he would leave everything behind, and he wasn't sure if he was ready or if he ever would be. Chapter 3. Through the canyon's edge. The morning air was cooler, a welcome change from the scorching heat of the previous days, but it did nothing to calm John's restless heart. He stood at the edge of his porch, watching Aiyana and her daughter prepare to leave. The horse was packed, their bags secured, and everything was set. John's boots scraped against the rough wooden floorboards as he stepped toward them, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice gravelly, carrying more weight than just the question itself. He didn't know why he was asking. The choice had been made for him, it seemed. Aiyana met his gaze, her face as unreadable as ever. "It's the only choice," she replied. Her eyes softened for a brief moment, then hardened again, like she had drawn a line in the sand that couldn't be crossed. She turned to her daughter, who was perched on a horse, her small body swaying with the rhythm of the beast, the sun casting long shadows across her face. "I never asked for this," John said, stepping forward to stand next to Aiyana, his hand resting on the brim of his worn hat. The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air between them. "But it seems like it's what fate wants." Aiyana didn't respond immediately. She glanced over at him, her lips pressed into a tight line, and then, to his surprise, she spoke with a calmness that made his chest tighten. "Fate is a strange thing, John Carter. Sometimes it forces us to see things we'd rather ignore." The words lingered in the air, and John, though he didn't quite understand them, felt the truth of them in his bones. With a heavy sigh, he turned and mounted Dusty, his horse standing patiently by. He looked at Aiyana, who was already mounted on her bay mare, her daughter securely on the saddle in front of her. "I don't know what I'm getting myself into," John muttered, his voice barely audible over the soft whinnying of their horses. "You'll find out soon enough," Aiyana said, her eyes scanning the horizon before she nudged her horse forward. "Follow me." As they rode through the plains, the landscape stretched out before them in endless waves of dried grass and barren earth. The sun began to climb higher in the sky, and the heat pressed down like an invisible weight. But it wasn't the heat that made John's skin crawl. It was a growing tension in the air, the gnawing feeling that they were riding straight into a world unknown, a place where rules and laws weren't made for men like him. The first few hours passed in silence, the only sound the steady clip-clop of hooves against the dirt and the distant calls of hawks circling above. John's mind raced, tried to process everything that had happened in such a short amount of time. 1 minute, he was living his quiet life on the ranch, and the next, he was riding through the desert with an Apache woman and her child, bound by a promise that seemed both too heavy and too insignificant all at once. Aiyana was a mystery to him, so strong yet so guarded. He saw the way her jaw tightened when she glanced at him, like she was trying to understand him just as much as he was trying to understand her. Hours passed, and the landscape grew more rugged. The smooth, dry plains gave way to jagged rocks and deep canyons. The sun beat down mercilessly as they descended into a narrow gorge, the walls towering on either side like silent sentinels. "You ever been down here before?" John asked, glancing up at the towering canyon walls, the red-brown rocks streaked with dust. Aiyana nodded, her voice cool and distant. "This is Apache land. We've been here longer than you've walked the earth, John Carter. This is where we belong." He felt a chill at her words, not from fear, but from the rawness in her voice. She was tied to this land, to her people, and now, so was he. As they continued deeper into the canyon, the shadows lengthened and the silence grew heavier. The canyon was both beautiful and suffocating, its walls closing around them as if the earth itself were keeping them trapped inside. They stopped for a brief rest by a small, bubbling stream that wound its way through the canyon floor. Aiyana dismounted gracefully, her movements fluid and effortless, as if she were at home in this place. John followed suit, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground as he walked toward the water. The cool liquid was a relief against the harshness of the desert, and he cupped his hands to drink. "I've never seen a place like this," John said, his voice low as he stared at the water, watching the way it caught the light. "It's peaceful, but it's also dangerous." Aiyana finished for him. Her gaze was distant, like she could see things John couldn't. "Yes, the world here is different. We live by the land, by the rules that have kept us alive for centuries." John looked up at her, searching her face for some sign of the woman he had met so briefly, the woman who had fed her daughter and now had him bound by a promise. But all he saw was a shadow, a woman who had lived a lifetime in a world he didn't understand. "Is this where your people are?" John asked quietly, his eyes scanning the narrow canyon walls, the sense of being watched heavy in the air. Aiyana's eyes softened just a fraction before she nodded. "Not far now, but it's not just the land that calls me back. It's my people, my history. They will want to see the man who made me a promise." Chapter 4. Tensions Rise. The evening sky turned blood-red as John and Aiyana descended deeper into Apache territory. The sun sinking low on the horizon, the heat of the day had softened, but the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. John could feel it pressing against him, heavy and palpable, like the earth itself was holding its breath. They had been riding for hours, the canyon walls narrowing as the path twisted like a serpent through the jagged rocks. The silence between them had grown, no longer a peaceful companion, but an unspoken wall between him and Aiyana. She rode ahead, her back straight and rigid, her face set in that unreadable expression of hers. The child had fallen asleep against her, her small body swaying with the rhythm of the horse, while John followed a few paces behind. The night was coming quickly, and with it, the realization that this wasn't just a simple journey to fulfill a promise. It was something far bigger. Aiyana had said it herself, "You'll see it soon enough." But John wasn't sure if he was ready to see whatever it was. Apache law, Apache culture. He had no place here, no place in their world. They stopped as the light faded from the canyon, the silence now broken by the distant calls of coyotes, the air growing cooler. Aiyana dismounted with practiced ease, as if she had done this 1,000 times, while John hesitated before following her lead. He stepped down from Dusty, his boots crunching on the dry ground as he moved toward the small campfire she had already started. It crackled, sending small sparks into the cool air. Aiyana looked over her shoulder, her dark eyes watching him as she knelt by the fire. "You should prepare yourself," she said, her voice quiet but heavy. "Tomorrow we will reach my people, and they will want to know why you are here." John swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling on him like a stone in his gut. He had prepared for this moment, or so he thought. He had told himself that he was just going to help Aiyana and her daughter. Nothing more, nothing less. But now, with every passing mile, it was becoming clear that the road ahead wasn't one he could turn back from. Not anymore. "Why bring me to them?" John asked, his voice gruff, the words harsher than he intended. "What do you want from me, Aiyana?" She didn't answer right away. She stared into the flames, the shadows of the fire dancing across her face. The wind picked up, swirling dust around them, and John's eyes narrowed against the sting. He was tired. Tired of the road, tire of the questions that kept building in his mind. But Aiyana didn't seem to tire. Her body was as still and unyielding as the desert itself. "I didn't ask for this either," she replied finally, her voice a low murmur. "But a promise is a promise. And it's more than just a word. It's a bond that binds not just you, but me. I carry that weight just as you do." John rubbed the back of his neck, looking down to fire as if it could offer him some comfort. "But what happens when your people find out I'm just a rancher, a man who doesn't belong here?" Aiyana's eyes flicked to his, her gaze sharp and unwavering. "It's not your place to decide that. It's theirs." John felt the words cut through him, like the first bite of a cold wind. She was right, of course. He was an outsider, an intruder in a world he didn't understand. And no matter how hard he tried to justify it, he couldn't deny the knot that had tightened in his chest since the moment he had agreed to follow her. This wasn't about helping her daughter anymore. It was about something bigger, something far beyond the promise he had made. The fire crackled, the orange glow of the flames casting an eerie light on the walls of the canyon. John sat down across from Aiyana, their eyes meeting in the flickering darkness. Her lips were set in a firm line, her posture straight as if she were prepared for whatever came next. But John wasn't so sure he was ready. He knew that when they reached her people, he would have to face whatever judgment awaited him. He didn't know if they would accept him or if they would throw him out, a stranger who would dare to enter their world. But he couldn't back out now, not after everything. The pull between him and Aiyana was undeniable, and for better or worse, he was bound to her, bound to this journey. Aiyana's voice broke through his thoughts, low and almost reluctant. "Tomorrow you'll meet my people. They'll test you, see if you're worthy. But know this, John Carter. If you fail, you will not walk away." John looked up sharply, his heart pounding in his chest. "What do you mean by that?" Aiyana's gaze never wavered. "Apache law is not kind to those who break their word, and I will not allow you to dishonor me or my daughter." The words hit him like a hammer, the full weight of the promise settling on his shoulders. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Aiyana, her daughter, and the law of her people. John felt the ground beneath him shift, like the canyon itself was swallowing him whole. The fire crackled louder as a gust of wind kicked up, the flames swaying in the darkness. John glanced over at Aiyana, the tension between them thick enough to choke on. She was waiting for him to say something, anything to break the silence, but he couldn't find the words. And then, in the quiet of the night, with only the stars above them and the canyon walls looming like ancient watchers, John realized something. This wasn't just a promise anymore. This was a test that would shape the rest of his life. And he wasn't sure he was ready for it, but he knew there was no turning back now. Chapter 5, The Apache Woman's Heart. The morning came quickly, the harsh light of the desert sun breaking over the jagged canyon walls like the edge of a blade. John had barely slept, his thoughts tumbling through the hours in a haze of unease and uncertainty. The cold desert night had crept into his bones, but it was the weight of what lay ahead that kept him awake. The narrow path they'd been following was almost complete, and as Aiyana had promised, they were nearing her people, her tribe. He watched Aiyana as she moved through their camp, her quiet grace in every movement, her focus unyielding. She was preparing for something. He could feel it. His eyes followed her, noting how she adjusted her daughter's blankets, brushed back strands of hair, and talked to the child in soft, low tones. There was tenderness there, but there was also a sharp edge to her, a hardness that couldn't be ignored. It was as if she carried the weight of the world in her bones, a world John could never fully understand. Aiyana turned to him after a moment, her face still set in its usual unreadable expression. "It's time," she said, her voice steady, though John could hear the underlying tension in it. She was not nervous, but there was something about the way she said it, a quiet finality to the words that made his chest tighten. John stood from his place by the fire, brushing the dirt from his trousers. He felt the familiar weight of his revolver against his side, the cold steel both comforting and unnerving. He wasn't sure what kind of test he was about to face, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to make it out without being changed. As they rode out, the path ahead seemed more treacherous than ever, the land around them growing more unforgiving. The sharp rocks jutting from the earth felt like ancient sentinels watching their every move, the wind howling through the narrow gaps like the whispers of those who had come before. John's eyes flicked to Aiyana, whose face remained hard and stoic, but the subtle tension in her shoulders told him she, too, was bracing for something. The canyon opened up slowly, revealing a vast stretch of land. Ahead, in the distance, a group of figures appeared, silhouetted against the dusty horizon. The movement of their horses was steady, purposeful, as they rode closer. John's pulse quickened. He had heard stories of the Apache, warriors, hunters, and survivors, but to see them now, in the flesh, brought a sense of awe mixed with deep uncertainty. As they neared, Aiyana spoke, her voice low, almost a murmur. "These are my people. They will not welcome you just because I brought you here. They will judge you, as they have judged all who have walked this earth before." John's breath caught in his throat. He had known this moment was coming, but facing it now felt like standing at the edge of a cliff. He felt exposed, stripped bare, unsure if he could stand up to whatever the tribe had in store for him. Aiyana's gaze softened for a brief second, a flash of something unguarded that John rarely saw. "But you have already shown courage. You've earned more than you know." The words lingered in the air as they approached a group of riders, a sense of anticipation building in John's chest. He tried to steady his breathing, but nothing seemed to calm the knot that had formed deep within him. The horses slowed, and the figures became clearer. An older man, his face wrinkled with age but still strong in his posture. A woman with a weathered face, her hands resting on the reins of her horse with quiet authority. A few younger warriors, their eyes hard, but not unfriendly. They all watched him as they circled around Aiyana, their gazes shifting between her and him. Aiyana dismounted first, with a fluid grace that seemed second nature. Her daughter followed, sliding from the saddle with ease, clutching Aiyana's hand as if for comfort. John hesitated for a moment before following, his legs stiff from the long ride. He wasn't used to standing before people who held his fate in their hands. But as he moved to join Aiyana, he realized there was no turning back now. The older man, his hair streaked with gray, studied John with an intensity that made him shift on his feet. There was no kindness in his eyes, only judgment, the kind that John had grown familiar with since he had set foot in Apache land. "Aiyana," the man said, his voice deep and commanding, "why have you brought this man before us?" Aiyana's response was calm, her gaze never leaving the older man. "Because he kept his word. He fed my daughter when we were starving. He saved us from death." The man's gaze flicked to John, scrutinizing him with a sharpness that felt like being pierced by 1,000 needles. John met his gaze, trying not to show the unease crawling up his spine. He knew that his fate rested on whatever these people decided, and he wasn't sure if that fate would be one of acceptance or rejection. The silence stretched between them, the weight of their stares almost suffocating. Finally, the older man spoke again, his voice softer now, but still full of authority. "You are an outsider," he said, his tone not unkind, but firm. "You walk in our land, in our world, and you have done something most would not do. You have earned the right to stand before us." John's heart pounded, and he had to force himself to breathe evenly. But before he could respond, Aiyana's voice broke the silence, and it was different this time, gentler, almost vulnerable. "But will you accept him as I have?" Aiyana asked, her voice carrying a weight of something unspoken, something deeply personal. Her gaze flickered to John, her eyes softening for just a moment. as if she were letting him into a part of herself she had kept hidden for too long. The man studied John for a long time, and for a brief moment, John wondered if he had failed the test. But then, slowly, the man nodded. "Let him prove himself," he said. "If he truly understands what it means to walk beside us, then he will earn his place." John exhaled slowly, the tension that had been building in his chest finally loosening. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a chance to prove that he belonged, not just Aiyana, but to the world she had brought him into. Aiyana stepped closer, and for the first time, she allowed herself to meet his gaze with something like tenderness. Her hand brushed his arm, a simple gesture, but one that made John's heart skip a beat. "You are not alone in this," she whispered, her words a promise he had no choice but to accept. And in that moment, standing before the tribe, with the weight of their gaze upon him, John realized that this was more than a test of strength or survival. It was a test of the heart, of loyalty, and of love, a love that neither of them had expected, but one that had already begun to bloom, quietly and fiercely, between them. Chapter 6. A New Dawn. The sky was still dark when John woke, the coolness of the desert night clinging to the air like a blanket that refused to let go. The campfire had burned down to embers, the soft crackle of dying with the only sound breaking the stillness. His muscles ached from the long days of riding, and his mind was no better, tired from the weight of everything that had happened. It had only been a few days since he'd first met Aiyana and her daughter, and yet it felt as though his entire life had shifted in ways he couldn't quite comprehend. He rose from his bedroll slowly, the cool sand beneath his boots grounding him to this moment. The faint light of the morning's first rays painted the horizon in soft hues of pink and gold, illuminating the vast, endless desert. The silence was broken only by the distant call of birds waking to the new day and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Aiyana was already awake, as always. She stood by the fire, her figure silhouetted against the soft glow of the rising sun, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Her daughter was asleep nearby, her tiny body curled up on a blanket. John's eyes followed Aiyana for a moment, studying her with a mixture of awe and unease. This woman, this fierce Apache warrior, had changed his life in ways he could never have anticipated. She had drawn him into her world, into a life that was wild and unpredictable. He was a man torn between two worlds, the quiet life of his ranch and the tumultuous reality of the Apache way. And as much as he tried to deny it, he felt himself being pulled further into this new life. The air was still cool, but the heat of the day was fast approaching. John stepped over to the fire, his boots crunching on the earth beneath him. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from sleep. He couldn't remember the last time he had truly rested. Aiyana turned, her dark eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze, something that wasn't there before. The hardness had softened just a little, replaced by an understanding, an unspoken bond that had been forged between them over the last few days. It was in the way she held herself, in the quiet strength she exuded, and in the way she looked at him now, as if they shared something deeper than mere words. "Morning," she replied, her voice low but steady. She had a fire inside her, one that John couldn't always understand, but one that he had come to respect. John sat down beside her, his legs stretching out before him as he studied the fire. For a long time neither of them spoke. The weight of their journey, of their promise to each other, hung between them. The tension of the days before was gone, but something else had taken its place, an understanding that this journey, this bond, wasn't going to be easy. After a few moments, Aiyana spoke again, her voice softer this time, almost hesitant. "You've changed since we first met, John Carter. I can see it in your eyes." John met her gaze, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Change how?" Aiyana didn't look away. "You were unsure of yourself. You were just a man trying to survive. But now," She paused, as though she were choosing her words carefully. Now you are a part of something. Something bigger. John took a deep breath, letting her words sink in. He hadn't realized it until now, but she was right. He had changed. He had become part of this world, whether he wanted to or not. And in a strange way, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward it, toward her. You're right, John said slowly, his voice low and thoughtful. I didn't ask for any of this, but now I can't imagine going back. Aiyana nodded, the corner of her mouth lifting in the faintest of smiles. There was a quiet, unspoken understanding between them now, a bond that ran deeper than either of them could fully articulate. It was more than just a promise. It was something rooted in trust, in survival, and in a growing, unspoken connection that neither could ignore. Aiyana turned toward the horizon, her eyes scanning the distance as if she were searching for something. Her voice was steady, almost distant when she spoke again. My people will test you today, she said, her gaze still fixed on the distant mountains. They will see if you truly understand what it means to live by Apache law. They will not be kind, and they will not be patient. They will challenge you in ways you cannot predict. John's stomach tightened at the thought, but he nodded. He had known this was coming, but now that it was here, he felt the weight of it in a way he hadn't before. The tests, the trials, they weren't just about surviving. They were about proving that he belonged here, that he had earned his place among the Apache. And in his heart, he knew this wasn't something that could be earned in a single day. I'll do whatever it takes, he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. Aiyana looked at him, her eyes softening for the briefest moment. I know you will, but know this. My people do not offer second chances. If you fail, you fail, and you will leave. Forever. John swallowed hard, the reality of her words sinking deep into his chest. It wasn't just about proving himself to her. It was about proving himself to an entire people, to a way of life that had been forged through hardship, blood, and sacrifice. The stakes were high, and the consequences of failure were even higher. But as he looked at Aiyana, standing there in the light of the morning, he felt something stir within him, a sense of purpose, a reason to fight. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for her daughter, and for the life he had promised to honor. He stood up slowly, his body stiff from the long ride. Then let's get started, he said, his voice steady and resolute. He didn't know what the day would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to back down. Aiyana gave him a sharp nod, her expression hardening as she prepared for the trials ahead. She turned toward the rest of the camp, where the other members of her tribe were already gathering. Follow me, she said simply. John followed her lead, feeling the weight of the world shift on his shoulders. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, John couldn't help but feel a strange calm wash over him. Whatever happened next, he knew he was ready. For the first time, he truly understood what it meant to belong. And with Aiyana at his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. Together, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, John Carter rode slowly to the vast, open plains, his horse's hooves kicking up dust behind him. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and the distant sound of a lone coyote's call. It was quiet, eerily so, after all the chaos that had consumed him in the last few weeks. Ahead, by the old oak tree where they had first met, Aiyana stood waiting. Her silhouette was framed by the setting sun, her dark hair catching the last rays of light as it danced in the wind. The same fierce Apache woman who had once declared that he belonged to her. But now, standing there in the golden glow of the evening, she looked softer somehow, more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. John dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth as he approached her, the weight of everything they had been through pressing down on his chest. Aiyana's eyes met his, and for the first time, there was no distance between them. No walls, just the shared truth of everything they had overcome. "I thought you were gone," she whispered, her voice a blend of hope and fear, her hands trembling as they reached for him. John cupped her face gently, his heart pounding in his chest. "I ain't going anywhere, Aiyana. Not ever." Her eyes softened, and a quiet smile spread across her face, the same smile that had first drawn him in all those weeks ago. As the last light of day faded behind the distant hills, John leaned down and kissed her, the world around them fading away, the promise they'd made, the lives they'd shared. Everything felt whole now, as if it had all led them to this very moment. And in that moment, with the wind in their hair and the stars just beginning to twinkle above, they knew they had found a home in each other, against all odds.